Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war and broader geopolitical update on a day where I'm just pumping out lots of news at the moment. Everything's happening all the time at the moment, and there's so much more I could report on. I haven't even scratched the surface of things like the State of the Union address by Trump last night, which was the usual Trumpian garbage, in all honesty. But yeah, so much to talk about. I am sort of purging myself of all of this information ahead of this weekend. Just to let you know, I'm away for the weekend down in West Country, and I will not be able to produce my normal output. I will try and get my hits and losses video out every morning, as I have done. I can't break the streak, right? I've been doing that every day for 3-4 years. I can't even remember how long now, just a long time, and I can't break that streak. So just bear in mind that it may be a little bit inconsistent over the weekend. I'm pretty exhausted now, just because I'm getting to bed too late, getting up too early, all that kind of stuff. So can the world stop doing lots of things all the time, please, and just give me a break? Okay, we are going to first go to this phone call between Trump and Zelenskyy. But before we get there, I've told you I've kicked out quite a few videos today. And one of my last videos, I think it's my last video, was this idea that we are entering the era of Terminator becoming reality, potentially. There is an AI company called Anthropic that has had a bit of an argument with Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, who has said that we, from a US point of view, we want to have complete control over any AI model or entity that is being contracted to the US Department of Defense. And if you don't agree to that, then screw you. You're not going to get a contract, and we'll put you on the bad supply list. And that will suck for you. And so there's this big argument between Anthropic and the DoD, because Anthropic doesn't want their AI to be used without a kind of human elements in a kill chain, whereby you can have these autonomous drone swarms just killing people, or autonomous surveillance, mass surveillance of citizens in the United States, and you can just let AI go for it and just hope for the best. And Anthropic are not keen on that happening, but Pete Hegseth is massively keen on that happening. Okay, or not necessarily the drone swarms killing lots of people, but they don't want to be constrained. And I was talking about how this is pretty, well, potentially very dangerous. Anyway, the reason I'm going over that again is because JR has just sent us a fascinating nugget that jives with what I've just said. So we're just going to look into that first and foremost, or first at least. In the meantime, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Legends, you all are, I'm sure you have subscribed, but just in case you've forgotten, that would be great, and it keeps you abreast of all the information going on in the world. Right, let's get into the deets. Okay, so this is what JR sent me, and good to have you all here in the live chat. Sorry, I'm doing so many of these at the moment. Sorry, not sorry. It's just the way it is. It's like a nightly live. Instead of you watching the news, you can just switch on ATP Geopolitics and listen to me talk rubbish about lots of things. JR sent this: AI bots from OpenAI, Anthropic as well, the company in question, and Google are more likely than humans to use nuclear weapons in simulated conflicts. In 95% of war games played by ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini in British research, conflicts escalated to nuclear warfare. So when you've got your man Pete Hegseth saying, yeah, no, we're honestly, it'll be law abiding, but we just don't want any constraints to be applied to the AI models. And you've got Anthropic saying, no, we're not happy with that. And they can actually say, and look, the reason we're not happy with that is because it turns out if you war game, including our AI models, but if you wargame AI models involving nukes, it turns out that 95% of the time they'll press that red button and we're all dead. So, I think we're justified in being a little bit cautious about the application of AI. Anyway, that was that. This is where I was truly going to start. And this will be a kind of recurring theme. It's been a theme right throughout the last couple of years, really. Well, the last year or so since Trump has come to the presidency. And I know I had this live stream last night. Actually, let's unpick that a little bit. Right. Before we get there, I had a live stream last night on the 4th anniversary, and it was Georgis, I think that's how you pronounce it, but I don't know. Myself, Greg Terry, and that's from Ukraine Matters, by the way, and Jonathan Fink. And right at the beginning, Georgis said, hey, let's not talk about Trump. We should be talking about Ukraine. It's all about Ukraine. Ukraine are the ones fighting. And we always talk about all these other entities, and it's kind of irrelevant, and I'm past it. Which is, fair enough. And I do understand that, because I do this too often. I go straight to Trump and start like whining about Trump, because justifiably he's doing crazy things. But when it comes to Ukraine, when you see the sheer volume of support in terms of monetary assistance, like we're talking about 90 billion euros from the EU that will keep Ukraine alive as a country. Okay. When you're talking about just the latest $600 million in energy assistance, when you're talking about another $8.1 billion from the IMF, when you're talking about Germany giving 11.5 billion euros this year, when you talk about the UK ramping up their military, industrial and financial support, and all these other nations, I think not to talk about how everyone is assisting, like Ukraine's defense of their own country is a joint effort. It is something where the Ukrainian people are fighting and they are the ones sacrificing their lives, but they are enabled, they're facilitated in doing that because predominantly Europe, but also Canada's just given a massive military aid package. Japan are really stepping up. You've got Australia, New Zealand, obviously, and other countries too. And you had the US with the potential to be a game changer. The US could just, I think, finish this conflict relatively quickly. If Trump had come in on January the 21st and decided the exact opposite of what he's doing now, then this war would be, Russia would be hammered economically at the very least. And so the decisions that international leaders make are super bloody important for the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And so, although I didn't sort of bite last night, if it was my own channel, I was just speaking to Georgis, I would have actually said no, and I'll put my case across. But actually, it was Jonathan Fink's live, it wasn't mine, and it was kind of right to concentrate on Ukraine because it's the 4th anniversary, and it needed to be centered on Ukraine. And I am guilty very much of often not centering it enough on Ukraine. But I do feel that this is when Zelenskyy says this is World War III, right? That's my point. And I said that in I've said this for years, right? If you came to my talk in Stockbridge in Hampshire, those of you who were self-harming enough to want to come and listen to me speak live as well as listen to me so much online, that was my case. And I made that, what was that 2024, summer 2024? I said, here's my case that this is World War III, right? Zelenskyy is saying this is World War III at the moment, which means it is involving loads of different nations. And without that assistance, Ukraine would be in a lot of trouble. And without China's assistance and North Korea's assistance and other nations to boot, Russia would be in all sorts of trouble, Iran, for example. And so it would be remiss of us to talk about all of these people and all of these countries. And what the main narrative that I am sort of trying to express at the moment is this divorce between the US and all of their otherwise allies, right? And Ukraine leaning more and more into European solidarity. And we're going to hear a little bit about that from Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart a little bit later. But this image, to me, I think sums everything up, which is, and this commenter here is absolutely right. It's so obvious that leaders from the Nordic and Baltic countries are genuine friends to Ukraine. And you can actually stretch that to Keir Starmer, to Emmanuel Macron, to Friedrich Merz, right? So I think the European leaders, there's a genuine warmth there and a genuine camaraderie and unity that I don't think you will ever see from Donald Trump. Now, Joe Biden is he was too old, but he was there. You know, he went to Kiev with his aviators on. Joe Biden went to Kiev. Trump has gone nowhere near that. Steve Witkoff has been to Russia 8 times or more and has not been to Ukraine, right? There is no desire to help Ukraine. And I think we're just really realizing now that really the United States, the Trumpian United States, is not an ally of Ukraine. Just pretty formally, there are ways that they are helping, but that's probably the legacy of a Pentagon that wants to help Ukraine. So you've got structures in place within the American government that still want to help Ukraine because they know what's good for the United States. But then you have this ideological layer over the top that is fighting against that. And I've talked so often about these two competing narratives and ideologies in the White House, in the government, in the American political establishment as a whole. You've got lawmakers who are really strongly supportive of Ukraine. You've got the Pentagon, other than the people that have been brought in to replace the purged lot. But broadly, you've got the Pentagon and I assume the CIA as well, very much on the side of Ukraine. And then you've got the president, the vice president, Stephen Miller, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, all these people that are just either actively anti-Ukraine and for Russia or just out for material transactional gain. And that causes tensions in the US, which is why you see flip-flopping on Ukraine, because at one point one of the narratives will win through and at another point it will be the other narrative, and it kind of flip-flops. But Ukraine can't afford to have that lack of predictability and reliability, and that is starting to come from Europe. However, like we talked a lot about last night, there is this lack of a vision for what victory looks like, and that might have something. My point last night was that might have something to do with having no central leadership. You know, imagine just the way that humans work, right? You guys and we're all down a pub, right? And we're all trying to organize what we're going to do for our Christmas do, right? And everyone's in different areas and you're all talking around different tables and you're all coming up with ideas. And then when you're interviewed by the local newspaper, what are you doing about your Christmas do? And you're like, oh, I reckon we're going to go here. And then someone else said, there's no kind of unity, right? So whether you like it or not, you need a leader. You need some kind of organizational hierarchy, because otherwise it's like herding cats. And although you've got all of these great supporters of Ukraine in Europe and Canada and beyond, they need to coalesce around a single central person who can then work out with Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians a vision of what victory looks like. Because otherwise you just get these repeated maxims of like, whatever it takes, we're here, we're as long as it takes, and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of meaningless, vague assurances that don't really do enough. But that's kind of all they can do, because no one's actually sat down and worked out what victory looks like and how realistic that is. And that's probably because there's also amongst those allies, you've got the United States that's working against victory, right? And so, and then you don't want to be seen to be working against the United States publicly and politically, and so it becomes really, really difficult. But that's the reality of it. I mean, we can all sit and slag off the fact that that no one's got a vision and we're not saying what victory looks like. Okay, it's easy to criticize, but what we need to do is understand why that is the case and what we need to do in order to make it otherwise. And I think, you know, realistically, that's where the role of NATO should come in, where NATO would be a military guiding organization that says, this is how Ukraine, and I think that's how it was to some degree earlier in the war. There was a lot more help for Ukraine within Ukraine from NATO allies. Now I think Ukraine has been in this long enough. They're probably doing a lot of their planning themselves. And also the US has gone kind of the other way. So the NATO is now not really sure where it's at, because you've got Mark Rutte trying to save NATO as an organization from extinction, because the US is trying to scale it down or indeed extract itself out of it. So this is a really, like, it's a really difficult situation to be in. Anyway, that's what I wanted to do. I haven't really started yet, and we're 15 minutes in. This is why my videos are so bloody long. Right. So you've got this picture here, and I just want you to compare this picture with the next image, right? So there's your friends, and here are your frenemies. So you have the United States abstaining in a UN resolution to support Ukraine because it included the term territorial integrity. In other words, the United States was not, or the Trumpian government was not happy that Ukraine or that the international community should desire that Ukraine has territorial integrity. Just honestly digest that for a second. So when I say the United States is not an ally of Ukraine anymore, it really demonstrably isn't. Like, if you're an ally of Ukraine, you would never abstain in a UN resolution vote because you were so upset that Ukraine might desire territorial integrity. That is absolutely outrageous. Now, Boris Johnson, who is a Trumpian through and through, is actually starting to be a little more, as a former Prime Minister of the UK, is starting to be a little bit more critical of Trump, or at least his government. Last year, he says, the United States managed to align itself with Russia and North Korea in voting against the UN motion supporting Ukraine. So if you remember, they actually voted down a motion last year. So this isn't actually particularly surprising. So he said this year, the US merely abstained. I suppose it's progress, but it's still truly shameful. So for Boris Johnson to call that shameful, for Keith Kellogg, as the former American envoy to Ukraine, to say a UN vote on a lasting peace in Ukraine, and we abstained. Go figure. The Russian Federation was against the proclamation. Is not 4 years of war enough? Is not missing children, shelling of cities, and the killing of innocents enough? It is not a business deal, it's a war. And that's a pointed statement, I think, against Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, given his position, his former position, Keith Kellogg. I think that's quite a condemnation, to be quite honest. And Boris Johnson's too. And just compare those two images. Well, you got the Norwegian Prime Minister, and I can't tell who that is. Is that Stubb? Alexander Stubb? It looks a bit young for him. Someone else. You know, European leaders there just warmly grasping Zelenskyy, and then at the same time, the US abstains on a vote in the UN. So I think that's a stark contrast there. Now, I'm going to go sideways now to Poland and then next Czechia. Ukrainians have generated 328.6 PLN, Polish, for the Polish economy, 8 times more than Poland spent on aid to Ukraine. And the employment rate among Ukrainians is 75 to 85%, which is higher than among Poles themselves. In other words, the refugees that have come to Poland have actually contributed more to the economy than the Poles have given to Ukraine. And in fact, as supportive of Ukraine as Donald Tusk is, there has been a dip in packages to Ukraine from the Tusk government, which is quite an interesting one. And I wonder why that is, though the Poles did give an awful lot before, and they might have kind of emptied the piggy bank. Then you have Czech Republic's income from Ukrainians is now double what it's paid out in assistance. The Czech state revenues for the first 3 quarters of last year were twice as high as aid spending, and the net contribution to the budget was 11.7 billion crowns. So we have exactly the same sort of situation going on here, which is, I think, pretty interesting. Jay in Kiev says these Eastern European countries were so easily conned by Russian propaganda into voting in pro-Russian populists like Babiš that they will now loot their countries. And they're now finding out that their aid to the Ukrainians is not a net outflow, but actually hugely profitable. That's one way of looking at it. Okay, moving on. We're going to go on to our favorite, Jabba the Hutt. Who was telling me the other day that does something just Jabba means toad, doesn't it? In an Eastern European language, maybe even Hungarian. Does Jabba mean toad? So Jabba the Hutt is I mean, he often is compared to both a toad and Jabba the Hutt. And it turns out that actually it's both. The EU could always trigger Article 7, which allows the EU to suspend a member state's voting rights and sidestep Hungary's opposition to the Ukraine package, but that could play into Orban's pre-election narrative. So there's this very difficult situation where, and I mentioned this in one of my videos earlier because I got it wrong yesterday, the 90 billion euro package that was signed off yesterday was signed off by the European Parliament, which is the large body of all the MEPs voted in from the regions of the countries of the EU. And then you have the European Council, which is a smaller body of the 27 heads of state of the European Union, and then the president of the European Council and European Commission. And anyway, I think it's probably von der Leyen and Antonio Costa. So you've got like 29 people voting, a much smaller body that decides the strategic direction of the EU, and it's that body that needs a unanimous vote in order for the 90 billion euros to go through. And Viktor Orban and I think Robert Fico are putting their foot down there and vetoing that. Now, I think there are plans afoot to try and get either Orban in line or to bypass Orban. We'll have to wait and see how that develops. But one option the EU has that they've had for a long time and they've been toying with is Article 7. There isn't really a mechanism in the EU. I guess they just never thought that anyone would actually want to leave, or not want to leave, but that anyone could be kicked out for backsliding that much, or for being anti-democratic, or for being anti, I don't know, EU or whatever. They never envisaged this situation where they would have to kick someone out the EU. So there's no mechanism. There's the Article 7 mechanism, which strips voting rights and certain other privileges, or can do. And that is an option for the EU to try and keep Orban in line. But then he's been saying that the EU is dictatorial, and he's campaigning on how evil the EU is. And if the EU then does something like that, that completely plays into his narrative that actually, you know, the EU are the enemy, and the enemy of the Hungarian people. So they need to be careful. They need to be careful not to interfere in the electoral process in Hungary, while at the same time really needing to do something about Viktor Orban. Zelenskyy here with Ursula von der Leyen says, with Ursula von der Leyen, we discussed a strategy to significantly strengthen Ukraine's resilience. The European Commission will support the repair of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, help build it, and strengthen the protection of the grid before the coming winter. This is one of the most important outcomes of our meetings yesterday, and its importance cannot be overestimated, especially given Russia's continued attempts to disrupt normal life in Ukraine. Together, we can ensure reliable energy supplies, decentralized generation, so on and so forth. So there's a closeness there. Again, it's about moving closer to the EU. And when you listen to Alistair Campbell, part of the Rest is Politics team, him and Rory Stewart, a former Conservative MP and cabinet minister, Alistair Stewart, former Labour Party spin doctor during the Blair years, both very strong supporters of Ukraine. Alistair Campbell has just been in Ukraine for the last couple of days, and he's been speaking to people, and absolutely fascinating, and we're going to dip into that. But the idea from almost all Ukrainians that he spoke to is that they are absolutely desperate, adamant, determined, I think better than desperate, to join the EU. Like, this is all about joining the EU. So it doesn't matter what your views on the EU are. Like, if you're a Brit who was for the British getting out of the EU, fair enough, whatever. But for these guys in Ukraine, it is absolutely paramount, not just for their national security, but for their economic prosperity and flourishing. and for all number of things, they feel they absolutely need to join the EU. They need to come out from that area between Russia and the EU, that political football between the two, to really solidify their role in the European Union. Right. Now, in terms of sanctions, so the 20th sanctions package is also at the moment vetoed, and I wonder what's going to happen with that. That's really important because actually that will cease maritime services for the shadow fleet. It's a really important package, that EU one, and I hope they find a solution for that. I'm sure they will. But Britain being, I mean, one of the Brexit gains, we don't have many, but one of the benefits is we can put sanctions on even if Europe doesn't, and Australia have done this as well. So Britain has announced its largest package of sanctions against Russia in the 4 years of the war against Ukraine, allocating £20 million for emergency energy support, 5.7 million for humanitarian needs, and an additional 30 million for projects aimed at strengthening the resilience of Ukrainian society. But first and foremost, it's a massive sanctions package that has been put on. They've also, and this has come from Marika Mikiashvili, I've interviewed her a couple of times, a Georgian. The UK is also part of that package was imposing sanctions on the Georgian Dream's key propaganda media outlets, Imedi TV and Post TV. And I think the Americans have as well, because the latest I heard from Marika was that Imedi is really struggling. It's shut down loads of their services, like their propaganda TV station, I think. They're having issues because they're being sanctioned both by the UK and I think the US possibly. But anyway, the sanctions from the UK included asset freezes, trust service sanctions, and director disqualification sanctions. And then, you know, lots of other information. So the UK really doing its part to put pressure on Georgian Dream and also pressure on Russia with a huge sanctions bill, along with, as I mentioned, the Australians too. Now, Germany, as I've said before, floated this idea of a European Five Eyes intelligence sharing framework with countries like the UK, France, Italy, and Poland. The idea is at this discussion stage at the moment. But this is interesting. So the UK might be pulled from pillar to post here, because obviously we're in the Five Eyes with Canada, the US, the Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. And the US is being so interesting at the moment that we are questioning the wisdom, I guess, of remaining in within that umbrella. But then the US intelligence services are really powerful. But this is just a sign that, first of all, that Europe is just standing up here, and it may include the US as well, right? But this is about the Germans definitely wanting to muscle in to, I think, muscle in on the military might in Europe. Because of the Second World War, the Germans have always felt a bit like they had to be more defensive rather than have an offensive army. They're now talking about, you know, ramping up espionage and offensive capabilities. There's very much a recognition that Russia are the bad guys and they need to be dealing with disinformation, as well as, you know, building up their own industry through military upgrading and enlargement. And then you've got other nations in the EU really recognizing the lack of reliability coming from America at the moment, and then the UK is kind of caught in the middle. But so often at the moment, I mean, it's good. I feel good from a Brit who would love us to rejoin the EU, right? So that's my position, and you guys know that. And actually, there are so many good signs from the EU that they are wanting us to be involved. Like, we're quite a responsible country in some ways. We were always, when we were in the EU, we were always quite an important voice in the EU. Our civil servants did a lot of work in the EU. That I think people, when we were voting for or against the EU, we never really understood what an important role the UK played within the EU infrastructure. And so I think there probably are nations that would love us back in principle, but then are we going to just be flip-flopping and unreliable? And you don't want that within the EU. So I completely understand that as well. Now, if Ukrainians want to return to Crimea, we will return to have Crimea returned. We all return to Crimea. We will support them, says the Swedish Defense Minister. Paul Jonsson said in an interview with a Polish outlet that Ukrainians themselves must determine what victory in the war with Russia will be for them. And this kind of talks to the idea I was just discussing. Maybe the Ukrainians at the top of the government don't really know what victory looks like. That sounds ridiculous because, you know, we had this chat last night and on the panel, and it's easy to say, yeah, well, victory looks like 1991 borders and Crimea back and etc. etc. Okay, yeah, that's what it looks like. But actually, what does it really look like? Because that's unlikely to happen, certainly militarily. And even diplomatically, that if that's your aspiration, then that's probably a long time off and would require Russia to completely collapse. So for the Ukrainians, is there a unified sense of what victory is for them? We don't know. Like, we don't know what victory looks like for Russia either. Like, you can talk about controlling the whole of Ukraine, but that's never going to happen. So it's always about what does victory look like conceptually and ideally in a utopia, and then what's a realistic plan for the outcome to this war. You can call it victory, you can call it what you like, but you know, where do you realistically think you're going to get to? And therefore, if that's your realistic plan, you're going to be planning for that. Like, I would be amazed if Ukraine is actually planning for a military victory to retake all of their territory. Like, you're not going to be, that would be a wasted plan on all those resources saying, yeah, we're going to retake Luhansk and Donetsk, which is going to steamroll through there. I mean, they're doing quite well at the moment in Halaipale area, taking tens of square kilometers. You know, it is difficult, and you need an absolute ton of people, and you need Russia to collapse in order to take all that back. You don't plan for that because that's a wasted plan. You need to plan for what you're actually going to be able to realistically achieve. So the question is, and I know this is, yeah, you say this is a defeatist attitude, Mitch, but it's not. Like if you were planning to retake the whole of Crimea, right? But you can put all of your planning efforts into retaking Crimea, right? And then you send all your troops to Crimea, and you've got no chance of militarily like, you do a landing on Crimea, on the west coast of Crimea, with all of your troops, and then you get the boats blown up on the way, and then you're landing. You can't land your equipment, and so on and so forth. It's like, yeah, well, I planned for this victory, this great victory. Yeah, but you couldn't achieve that. It's not realistically achievable. So therefore, you're either going to plan for it and do it and fail, or you're going to waste your time planning and all the resources when you should be planning for, I don't know, you know, taking the Kimburn Spit maybe, or you know, retaking Pokrovsk as or retaking Konstantinivka or something like that. You know, you can call it defeatist. I would just call it realistic. Like, I hope that Ukraine will take all of that territory back, but in my view, you would require Russia to. So for me, the planning involves the complete destruction of the Russian economy. I mean, that just has to happen. So I'd be absolutely bombing my plans would be bombing the crap out of Russia from a distance and doing everything from a distance, scaling up industry to a huge degree, and aviation, and getting guided glide bombs and using them to absolutely hammer the front lines. That's probably quite a long-term thing. It takes a long time to build that kind of expertise and industrial capacity up. But I don't think I'm being defeatist. I think I'm being realistic. I want Ukraine to win, but I want Portsmouth to win the Champions League. But if I was Portsmouth manager at the moment, when they're in the Championship in the UK, which is like the second division, or planning to win the Champions League next season, and I put all these plans in place, those are going to be wasted plans, because we're going to not get out of the Championship within the next season anyway, and we're not going to be in the top 6 or whatever it is to get in the Champions League and the Premiership. So I can, and then you say, well, you're being defeatist. I'm not being defeatist. I know where Portsmouth is at the moment, and I know what they are. Conceptually, of course, they could win the Champions League. Reality is different from abstract conception, and so I think that there needs to be that. But going back to my initial point, I think here, and this actually defends my point, which is Paul Johnson says Ukrainians must themselves determine what victory in the war with Russia will be for them. And that's exactly my point, is that, I mean, he's a defense minister for Sweden. So he should have a fairly good idea of what victory should look like for Ukraine. But he's obviously saying, I don't know what it looks like, because he's even saying that the Ukrainians don't know what it looks like. And so you probably got different ideas of what victory looks like within Ukraine itself, from within the government and the military and so on and so forth. So we're talking about a unified sense of victory throughout Europe and throughout the Allies, but I wonder whether that's even a case within Ukraine, right? I will leave this issue of territorial integrity to the people of Ukraine and its president. If they want to return all of the Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, we will support them in this. And if they want to start negotiations, we will also support them in this. Johnson added that Sweden has increased its support for Ukraine so that it can negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. In particular, in 2026, Stockholm will provide Kiev with $4 billion in aid, and the same amount is reserved in 2027. And this is great. So they say, look, we are supporting Ukraine with a whole bunch of kit. And Canada have done this as well. But I was looking at some of the stuff that Canada's given to Ukraine, and this massive load of military aid. And I'm just thinking, like, that is great, and they would definitely appreciate all of that. But actually, they need more this than they need that. So they're giving a load of like senator mobility vehicles, but they can make those themselves, given the money. But of course, what all these nations are doing is like, how can we help Ukraine win by also supporting our own industry? So like, here's a bunch of Rochelle Senator vehicles. Yeah, we don't really need them. We make our own Novotors and Cossacks. Yeah, but here are a load of Rochelle Senators, because that makes a load of jobs back in Canada. And you understand why they want to do that. We want to give you a load of Canadian stuff. And the Ukrainians like, brilliant, that is great, because actually it means we don't have to build that and it's cheaper. Like, brilliant, give it to us. But actually, we can build that. What we really want are freaking ballistic missiles. And what we really want are freaking cruise missiles. And what we really want are freaking Gripens, right? Give that to us now. And so there are always tensions between, fully helping Ukraine realize its victory, and also fully helping Ukraine as much as you can, whilst also helping your own industry to build stuff that makes your industry flourish, right? Anyway, yeah. So, okay, moving on. This is great from Croatia. Croatia rejected European pressure to let Russian oil tanker pass through a territory of Croatia to Hungary and Slovakia. Categorically, no. Gone are the days in Europe, says this source, and the EU, when only France and Germany made decisions. Croatia will not turn its back on Ukraine. This is interesting, because Croatia recently said no to Hungary getting oil through a pipeline in Croatia, saying we ain't going to help the Russians. And then they've also said, and we ain't letting the Europeans have put pressure on them. I assume that probably means the Hungarians as well, to let an oil tanker pass through Croatian territorial waters. And they've said, nah, ain't happening. Screw you guys, which is awesome. Viktor Orban. So we're moving back to Hungary. Viktor Orban attacks Ukraine and claims that without cheap Russian oil, Hungarians would pay 1,000 florins, €2.64, instead of 560, €1.48 per litre of fuel. Okay, what you're hearing from Orban very often is that we want cheap fuel, and the only way of getting cheap fuel is through Russia, and anything else will see a massive inflationary pressure put on the Hungarian economy. Shabalix Panyi says, I fact-checked this and it's false. Hungary already has the second highest fuel price in the region and the highest pre-tax price. In other words, they get their fuel from Russia and it's more expensive than anyone else in Europe. So actually, you're better off not getting your fuel from Russia, but getting it in the way that other European countries around you do. But of course, that won't please his political bosses, right? Kate from Kharkiv here. This is a video. She posts a video of Radoslaw Sikorski, the foreign minister for Poland, saying the thing that shocks me fundamentally is that while Ukraine is defending itself against the might of the Russian army, Hungarians used to understand what it's like. Budapest was invaded twice in the 20th century, only once by the Red Army, so once by the Russians. I would have expected a much greater feeling of solidarity from Hungary for Ukraine. Instead, with the help of the state propaganda and private media controlled by the government, the ruling party managed to create a climate of hostility towards the victim of aggression. And now it's trying to exploit that in the general election. It's quite shocking. Really going to town on Hungary here, Radoslaw Sikorski, really very critical of Orban and the campaign to victim blame Ukraine. And in fact, it's getting worse than that. So let's look into that in a moment. First, let's get an understanding of where the polls are. The Hungarian opposition party TISA has increased its lead over Orban's Fidesz party to an unprecedented 20%, according to the Median poll. TISA has the support of 55% of voters who have decided on their choice, compared to 35% for Fidesz. In other words, they're more. The way I understand that is that the people who are voting for TISA are more sure of their vote than the people voting for Fidesz, and that's a good sign. It seems that Trump administration's endorsement of Viktor Orban is already doing wonders. The opposition party TISA now has a solid 20-point lead, says Pekka Kaleniemi. So this bombshell poll has a 55 to 35 lead for Peter Magyar's TISA over Orban's Fidesz KDNP coalition, enough for a super majority in parliament. The survey was conducted by Median, widely seen as the country's most reliable pollster. Right. Now, last night for the panel, everyone agreed that Orban will try and cheat his way to victory. The good news for Hungary is that the EU will be looking at this very closely, and the political future of Hungary in the EU rests, I would have thought, on what happens in this election. Orban has a choice then of taking Hungary out of the EU, but I can guarantee that that won't go down well with a large section of the Hungarian population, because even though it's got the lowest, it's got the highest corruption rate and kind of the worst functioning economy in the EU, that's in spite of the EU. That is because of Viktor Orban being Eurosceptic and being a grifter and having endemic corruption. So, the hope for Hungary is that while they are going to try and cheat their way to victory, the EU at least might have some checks and balances in place to mitigate against that. Stratcom Center says, now trailing by 15 points for the coming elections, Hungary's Russian-backed Orban regime has just released an urgent propaganda video to convince voters that Ukraine is somehow about to attack. So Ukraine, haven't got enough on their plate already. We always worrying about how they don't have enough missiles, how they don't have enough troops. Now Orban is literally communicating to his electorate that Ukraine is about to attack Hungary. And this then gives him the pretext to implement possibly martial law and then some control over the election, maybe? I don't know. But that is definitely a serious worry. And he's also talked, this has come out today as well, he has said that as a result of this, he is going to possibly put soldiers' energy infrastructure. I mean, he's literally mobilizing, by the looks of it, the military in light of this supposed threat from the Ukrainians. Is absolutely ridiculous. But, this could all be part of, and almost certainly is part of, his attempt to cheat his way to electoral success. Now, his colleague in crime, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, said Slovakia could take additional measures because, vetoing these huge assistance packages to Ukraine isn't enough, they could take additional measures regarding Ukraine due to the situation with the Russian oil transit through the Druzhba pipeline. He stated that the government is preparing steps if Kyiv fails to restore supplies of already paid resources. Now, today, I think Zelensky said something along the lines of, look, the Druzhba pipeline keeps getting blown up by Russians. We're not going to send people to go and fix this pipeline in Russia if they're just going to blow up our emergency repair workers. So, you need to deal with this. It's a Russia problem, was Zelensky's comeback, broadly speaking. Now, speaking of the EU, Dave Keating here points out that Iceland is preparing to bring forward its referendum on joining the European Union to August. So Iceland isn't in the EU. It has a kind of has a relationship with the EU, rather like Norway's not in the EU proper, Switzerland isn't in the EU proper, but they do have varying relationships with the EU rather than just being completely out of the EU. So kind of hybrid arrangements. Quote, escalating threats from, and this is the interesting part, this is from Politico, escalating threats from the US, among them a joke by US Ambassador Billy Long that Iceland could become the 52nd state of America, have increased the urgency. So not only has Greenland been put under threat by the Americans, and then you've had the envoy to Greenland, who is also the Louisiana governor, isn't he? I forget his name. Is it Landry? Anyway, the Louisiana governor, who is basically regurgitating Trump's more aggressive tones with Greenland. You have the similar approach by the US ambassador to Iceland. It's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, you can joke it'll be the 52nd state, but do you know what? That won't go down very well with the Icelandic community. Icelanders will not be happy with jokes from the ambassador that Iceland will become the 52nd state of America, when just next door Greenland is going through an existential crisis as a result of these threats. It's just incredible what the United States under Trump is doing at the moment. Just unthinkable gaffes. Well, you would think they were gaffes, this Billy Long saying what he's just said, but they're not gaffes. It's all part of the ideology and part of the plan. It's just incredible stuff. Anyway, fascinating Financial Times article. Donald Trump's state of mind is a global risk. You are starting to see articles and opinions be written about Trump that show that people are genuinely worried about his state of mind. I had someone, John Reed earlier, a more conservative commenter, going, "Oh, did you see Trump last night? Almost 2 hours, State of the Union address, speaking. You're telling me he's got dementia? That's amazing, blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, are you telling me he hasn't had cognitive decline? I mean, I'm not saying 100% he's got dementia, but he's certainly exhibiting over time an awful lot of characteristics that show, at the very least, cognitive decline, in a way that if that had been Biden, you would have been spitting at the screen. And the fact that he's banging on for 2 hours, going off on these weaves and whatnot, and half of it's nonsensical garbage, is evidence to me that the man's an utter wingnut. Now, the Financial Times have published a commentary, says Gandalf, arguing that Donald Trump's state of mind presents a global risk. The headline frames his personal judgment and decision-making as factors with potential consequences beyond the United States, suggesting that his leadership style and unpredictability could affect international stability, financial markets, and geopolitical relations. The article is presented as a serious political and economic assessment rather than a campaign statement, signaling concern within parts of the global financial and policy community about how US executive decisions influence allies, adversaries, trade flows, and security structures worldwide. And this brings me on to the next, this is going to be an excerpt from the video. So this is a segue, because I think Trump is, I think he's nuts, but I actually think the ideology comes from people around him. and that ideology is genuinely dangerous. And I think everyone who knows what they're on about recognizes this now, including the Ukrainians, and they recognize that the US genuinely isn't an ally anymore. And I'm sorry to say that and keep repeating it for my really good American friends and listeners who are mortified that the government has moved in that direction. This is Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. Alistair Campbell's just been to Ukraine, or he's in Ukraine. I don't know if he's still there now, but anyway, at the time of this recording, he was in Ukraine. This is a few minutes of his thoughts and their thoughts on the matter. If you get a chance to listen to this hour-long chat, it is one of the best analyses of what's going on at the moment that I've seen for some time, and in Ukraine for some time. It is also fully aligned with my thinking. Probably why I like it so much is because I was just nodding, saying, yep, that's what I've been saying. Yep, that's what I've been saying. Yep, that's what I've been saying. So it feels like some form of kind of vindication. But here are the two of them talking about Alistair's experiences.
But I think that is worth thinking about. I mean, it's so interesting. This is why the tragedy of us being out of the European Union now, because the Europeans really, really regret and miss the UK being there. But at the same time, when you're having these discussions on the bigger picture about what's happening in Ukraine and the future of Ukraine, it's all about the European Union. The whole aim of their existence now is to get inside the European Union. A lot of disappointment about America. You know, you and I are quite biased on this, but I'll try and park my own bias. One of the people I met who's not in government, but somebody quite close to government, and said, you know, it's just infuriating to see this Witkoff guy and Trump announcing we're close to a deal, the negotiations are ongoing. She said, they're not real negotiations. They're completely fake. They're totally performative.
My understanding of the situation is that...
Just to let you know that Alistair Campbell has been travelling with, I forget her name, but she's a woman who's in charge of EU enlargement. And he says, absolute force of nature, works her backside off. You know, all of these meetings, and it's all to do with, you know, getting Ukraine into the EU and that kind of enlargement. And of course, she'll be dealing with all sorts of other countries as well. And so this, what his opinions here, they are coming from speaking to a lot of Europeans that he spent a lot of time with, discussing Ukraine and the EU. I mean, he shares, obviously, to go into Ukraine, you have to get the train from Poland, and so, you know, he's spending a lot of time with these people that he's traveling with.
Trump and Witkoff, particularly Witkoff, have been pushing ahead. And just to remind listeners, they started with what was essentially a series of Russian talking points, the Russian maximalist position. And their original peace plan, which terrified everybody a few months ago, was effectively going to give Russia more territory than it had already taken, de facto recognition of that territory, lift all the sanctions, limit the size of the Ukrainian army. And that was resisted. It was actually resisted not just by Ukraine, but it was resisted by the European Union and the UK and everyone that said this is not good enough.
Well, it kind of led to, in a way, to the coalition of the willing, to that concept. And the coalition of the willing are having a meeting literally right now as we speak.
Tell us about them. Tell us a little bit about that concept and those people.
Well, it is obviously Zelenskyy, and it is a lot of the European, in particular, the European nations. So to give you some of the names who were at the ceremony today, Jonas Gahr Støre, who we interviewed on Leading, Prime Minister of Norway, Mette Frederiksen, who we also interviewed, Alexander Stubb, who's coming out very, very soon on Leading. They were all there today. So they will go off with Zelenskyy, with von der Leyen, with others, and then Keir Starmer, Macron, Merz are all on video calls somewhere else. And I think one of the things that is being discussed is the extent to which the change in the American position, and particularly now on spending. I mean, I don't know about you, Roy, I find it completely absurd that the Americans are still calling the shots on whether there should be a negotiation process and what it should be, when right now the Americans are making money out of all this, paid for by the Europeans buying American kit to supply to Ukraine.
It does, from the outside, seem completely insane. I think we talked about this probably when Trump came in, that what is likely to happen if the US stopped providing money and started causing difficulties for the Ukrainians is that they would lose leverage. If they're no longer the central player on the battlefield, and they've basically cutting $50 billion worth of support for Ukraine, At some point, people are going to turn around and say, actually, you don't really matter. Not just Ukrainians will say you don't really matter because you're not actually as vital to our war efforts as you might have been 2-3 years ago because you've just given us $50 billion less. But even the Russians might say, actually, we don't necessarily need to negotiate with you because you're not as critical to the war efforts. Now, there's still certain things that the US is doing, which are quite interesting and I don't quite understand. I was talking to my friend Shashank Joshi this morning from The Economist, and he was pointing out that some of these very successful recent long-range Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil facilities depend on US intelligence to be able to navigate around radar systems and get to the location. For some reason, the Americans are still facilitating that, and that will be a problem if they take it away. But in other regards, you're absolutely right. I mean, if Europe has been forced, partly by the US, to provide an extra 100 billion euros of money, and the US is providing zero, and if the US wants to say, Europe isn't our problem, Europe should step up, Europe needs to deal with Russia, Europe needs to pay, Europe needs to fight, we don't care about Ukraine, then why is Europe not leading the negotiations instead of the US?
Well, I think that's a very, very good point. And when we were in Munich, remember after you left, I went to the event on the Arctic where Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, was there. And somebody said to him, now that Europe is paying all this money and buying all the kit for Ukraine, which the Americans used to do and used to give, why are the Europeans not front and center in the negotiations? And he gave a very, very honest answer. He said, because Putin doesn't want us there and Trump lets him. Now,
that is the key. Why are Europe not at the table? Because Putin is dictating things and the US is allowing themselves, or Trump is allowing himself to be dictated to by Putin. That answer from Boris Pistorius, that is a pretty much a summation of everything that is wrong at the moment with regard to the relationship with the United States and United States' foreign policy with regard to Russia and Ukraine. Absolutely incredible. I think that
has to change. He said and center in the negotiations. And he gave a very, very honest answer. He said, because Putin doesn't want us there and Trump lets him. Now, that has to change. The other thing that I saw, in fact, somebody here pointed out to me, I was talking to them about the Americans, and they played me this clip of an interview that Witkoff did this week. He said two things which were mind-blowingly stupid. The first,
this is the one I said I'd do a video to, but I haven't, because I did react to this in one of my videos to you, and I just got really angry. Like, this is where, if I was in a room with Steve Witkoff, I would probably want to punch him full in the face, and I'd have to be held back from doing so, because this, I think, is insanely insensitive and just downright rude, stupid, and ignorant, and morally just not good enough.
First was, quote, "This is a very silly war." Okay, now you can talk about it being a horrible war, a brutal war, but silly makes it sound like a kind of Monty Python sketch that's gone a bit wrong. It's a war that Putin has started. The next thing he said was, Putin has always been very straight with me. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean when he keeps saying, and Trump keeps saying, that we're getting there, we're making progress? What is the progress that's being made when he's being straight? Because
and you've heard this again today from JD Vance. So you've just had a phone call interestingly, between Trump and Zelenskyy, not one I was aware that was going to happen. And they've been discussing topics that we'll be discussing more detail tomorrow in Geneva, as they are due, or at least the parties, I think, are due to meet in Geneva. You've had JD Vance talk on TV about how he thought the war would be easy to sort out, but it actually has been much more difficult, but we're getting there. We get all the stuff that you're hearing Alistair Campbell say there. No reports have said that Zelenskyy spoke with the US president for half an hour and with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner on the call as well, thanking them for their efforts to end the war. He said teams will work in Geneva tomorrow and prepare a full trilateral meeting in early March. But the problem here is America is still seen as the nation that's pulling the strings. Just absolutely infuriating.
his public positioning, Putin has not changed 1 inch since the start of this.
And I think one of the interesting things is that Trump's defense people have been proved wrong. Their basic view, I think, unless I've got this wrong, is that actually, and this was basically J.D. Vance's line before the election, so going back 18 months now, was Russia's going to win anyway. Russia is a much bigger, much stronger country. America's wasting its money, and all it's doing is prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainians. Ukraine's got to accept that it's inevitably beaten. And given that Russia's definitely going to win, we might as well stop spending any money on it, and then let's go and make some deals with Russia. Let's drop the sanctions, let's get some mineral deals, let's make some money because Russia's going to win anyway. And where they've been proven wrong is despite the fact that the US has done almost everything conceivable to weaken the Ukrainian side.
Despite the fact that the US has done everything conceivable to weaken the Ukrainian side. What a statement for Rory Stewart to make there.
Let's make some money because Russia's going to win anyway. And where they've been proven wrong is despite the fact that the US has done almost everything conceivable to weaken the Ukrainian side.
Yeah.
Number one, no more money. Number two, actually stopping even selling weapons often. Number three, occasionally turning off entire systems. Number four, making it clear that all the NATO security guarantees are much flimsier and weaker than they were in the past and threatening Greenland and all this kind of stuff. Despite all of that, what the Trump administration would have predicted, because they think the US is the only power in the world and Ukraine is too weak and the EU is too weak, they assumed that the Ukrainians would collapse like a house of cards. Yeah. And they would bring about what they predicted, which is that Russia would win and get all this stuff, and then we'd lift sanctions. Actually, they've been proved completely wrong. What's actually happened over the last year is that I think over the last 6 months, Ukraine now seems to be paradoxically almost in a stronger position than we thought it was in 6 months ago, because it's managing to do these long-range strikes.
And this is what we were talking about last night in the panel as well, is that you know, people saying that actually they're in a stronger position. And I you know, my view has always been, if they can scale up production of their own missiles and drones to a significant level, then that is Ukraine in the ascendancy. That's what Ukraine needs. You know, this is the latest drone bomber map, and good to see that again. Didn't see one like this last night, but it looks like Ukraine is attacking. There's an airport repair center that I think has been hit tonight already. Pretoria Airport aircraft repair center, in Crimea. So that is Ukraine being strong and stronger than it was. And that is completely against the narrative that the Americans, qua J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and others, have been spinning. Russia is just much bigger country than you. You cannot hope to prevail. So therefore, let's make some money out of you while you capitulate to Russia, and we'll be all right. Thank you very much, making money. You do some deal with Russia, and then don't really care about you thereafter. And Russia don't really care about them as long as we're making money out of both of you. And that's really how I see the foreign policy of the Trump administration. Very transactional, very self-absorbed, whereas the Europeans have a different view, partly out of self-interest, because this is an existential threat to Europe, right? And so there is a necessity to make sure that Ukraine prevails in the negotiations in a way that Trump, especially if you don't care for NATO, really doesn't give a damn about. Well, Ukraine aren't going to be in NATO. NATO sucks anyway, and pretty much want to see the end of that because they don't really care about Europe. Europe can get on with itself. If it's an existential crisis to Europe, that's your problem. And we're just going to worry over here about, I don't know, the Western Hemisphere and Greenland and Canada and Mexico and Cuba and Venezuela.
It's managing to do some very targeted attacks against Russian infantry. It's managing also to do these very surprising counterattacks with small troops into Russian territory. Russia has killed and wounded 1.2 million casualties, which is more than anyone has lost since the Second World War. In fact, our defense minister, Al Khan's, says that they've lost more than the Americans lost in the entire Second World War, at least 350,000 killed. They're having difficulty replenishing. And Ukraine now seems to be able to manufacture long-range missiles rather than being totally dependent on everyone. So actually, it's not just that they are cruel and unpleasant, they actually proved to be completely wrong in their predictions, and somebody needs to call them out. Their assessment of the defense and security situation and the relative strengths of Russia and Ukraine and the relative strengths of the US and the EU turned out to be completely wrong. Trump was wrong.
And that is what leads me to say, the talks in Geneva recently, Rory, I don't know if you're aware of this. So you had Witkoff, you had the Russians and the Ukrainians, okay, meeting in Geneva. It didn't go anywhere. The Ukrainians came out and said that what they say, the Russians came out and said, then Witkoff said it's going very well. Then he went back and played golf with Trump. And what's interesting about that, though, is that officials from the UK, Germany, France, and Italy just turned up. Okay.
Uninvited. They just turned up.
They didn't get in the room, but it meant they could talk to the Ukrainians. They could hang around. Now, I honestly think the next time that Trump comes out and says, I'm sending Witkoff and I'm sending Jared Kushner, and it's time for Ukraine to get its act together and get to the table, I think Keir Starmer, Macron, Maloney, Merz, Tusk, I think they should just turn up. I know there would be sort of, but let's be honest, Trump deals with diplomacy in a very unconventional way.
Yeah.
But you know, the only senior American I've seen here is Mike Pompeo, another interviewee from Leading. But
So I'll leave it there. And Pompeo was only there because he's associated with Firepoint as their advocate or advisor or whatever, consultant. But that's absolutely right. So I really think that's a good idea because Trump does things outside of the book, right? He doesn't adhere to norms. So it's about time that Europe just goes, right, bollocks to this. If there's going to be a trilateral meeting, we're turning up. If the meeting's not in the US, right, then we can bloody well turn up. And if it's in Geneva and Switzerland, we're turning up like we did last time. And we need to start asserting ourselves. I'm speaking on behalf of European leaders here, or just allies of Ukraine. We need to start asserting ourselves into the negotiations and start to sideline the United States, because Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner do not have the best interests of Ukraine at heart. End of. So there you go. Right, we're going to move off that now. Just going to try and relatively quickly finish the rest off. The border peace. I just want to do a little bit of analysis, or I'm not going to do it. Dave Troy's going to do it for us. The border peace. We have a problem brewing with this, and it needs much more attention. One, there is no legal entity for Board of Peace organized under the laws of any country, meaning it is subject to no country's laws. Two, Trump is acting like the US is party to it as a treaty organization, but only Congress has the power to approve that. The Board of Peace. 3, the Board of Peace is collecting and distributing funds via JP Morgan, playing as banker, but this must be a violation of Know Your Customer laws since the Board of Peace doesn't exist. It is a transnational mafia backed only by the executive power of its members. Now, this is right. From what I can work out, there is just no official framework for this thing. It is just Trump and his cronies grifting off international geopolitics. 4, since the Board of Peace doesn't exist, USPTO is legally holding its trademarks on its behalf, violating the Lanham Act, which requires that holders intend to use marks in commerce. I don't know what that's about per se, but another issue. 5, Trump signed the Executive Order 14375, protecting the Board of Peace under the International Organizations Immunity Act. But this merely protects from interference. It does not legitimize or establish the organization. 6, Trump is saying he intends to use it to oversee the United Nations. There is no provision in the UN Charter for any such oversight organization. What he means is that he's going to extort the UN by withholding US dues. This is a power play. Like he's already defunding the United Nations and then pouring that funding into the Board of Peace and then using that as leverage over the United Nations so that he can dictate to the United Nations through funding what happens in the United Nations. This thing needs to be challenged legally and practically. If it is not stopped, it will quickly evolve into a world takeover mechanism. And indeed, it is already usurping US sovereignty as well as sovereignty in Gaza and of participant countries. Seriously, this is no joke. An intervention is necessary now. The illegal trademarks are one pathway in. There are others, but whatever you do, don't brush this off as another of Trump's follies. It's anything but. I really agree with this. And I really think stuff like this needs to be taken way more seriously than it is, I have to say. Right, okay. I don't know if any of you are putting stuff in the live chat. It looks to me like the live chat feature that I'm looking at has pretty much stopped working. So I'm just going to load up this video live on my own channel. The platform I'm using is not allowing, I think, live comments. Yeah, there's loads more. So I don't know what you guys have been saying, or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe comments. Maybe you guys have just got bored and aren't commenting much. Okay, so we're now going to go on to. Oh, maybe you are there. I just you guys were so entranced. That was it. I'm going to go back to. Well, I'm going to go on to American foreign policy here with regard to the tariffs. And you had this situation, remember, where the Supreme Court found the tariffs were not justifiable. And so they've been stopped. And then he said, I'm going to put 10% tariffs on across the board on everyone. And then actually, I'm going to put them up to 15%. There are some claims at the moment that actually that when they're coming through, they're less than 10%. So there might be some kind of weirdness going on with them. But anyway, there are also some claiming that these new tariffs are themselves illegal as well. So it is not clear that he actually has proper justification for these new tariffs. So the new 15% Section 122 tariff quietly blows up every single trade deal negotiated so far. So the other problem here is that all of these trade deals that say the UK, the EU, Canada, all these other nations have been trying to do to try and please the Americans who have been threatening them with bigger tariffs, done all these trade deals, but now these new tariffs effectively render those deals defunct. Because you're like, well, you come to a carefully crafted agreement so that we've got tariffs on this, tariffs on that. We do this, you do that, we do this. And, you know, these take immense amount of organization, right? And then Trump comes along and says, oh, and by the way, you know that trade agreement that we got, you got 15% tariffs on top of all of that, everything. It's like, no, but we can't have that, because then that invalidates we have just said that for like dairy products, we will have a 10% tariff on your dairy products coming in, but you will put, as a result, that only a 6% tariff on our automotive parts or something like that. So you have a very particular agreement, and then you say you put 15% on everything, so that puts dairy up, so that invalidates that carefully crafted agreement. So all four frameworks, UK, EU, Switzerland, and China, were implemented via IEPA executive orders, which are now void after yesterday's SCOTUS ruling. So when you had these IEPA, the ones that the Supreme Court found unjustifiable, you've had entire trade deals based on the IEPA executive orders. They are now non-existent. So then actually the tariffs that you were talking about to do these individual deals are now themselves gone, and then it's just a complete nightmare. The deals promised country-specific rates, 10% for the UK, 15% camp for the EU and Switzerland, 10% truce with China. Section 122 replaces them with a uniform 15% surcharge on top of already existing rates, critically not as a ceiling. Products promised MFN-only treatment now face MFN plus 15. So you've pre-existing tariff rates that aren't IEPA tariffs will then, so say you've got like 25% on grain, that's now going to be 40% on grain. Every deal is thus breached, so there are no deals left standing. Every trading partner knows this. Compounding the issue, Section 122 requires, quote, large and serious balance of payments deficits. The US runs a goods deficit, but a massive services surplus, and attracts circa $1 trillion a year in capital inflows, mostly from European money. There is simply no balance of payment issue, so this will be challenged in court. In other words, these Section 122 tariffs are themselves arguably not legal, and that just causes all sorts of chaos again. Now the European Parliament is taking all this on board, and the trade chief is preparing to freeze the ratification of the EU-US trade deal. So the EU-US trade deal is now off. It's off the table. Translation: Europe is done signing blank checks while Washington experiments with tariff roulette. Before approving anything, Brussels wants actual details on the administration's trade policy. Trade agreements require predictability, not mood swings. And then you have Trump's 15% tariff proves the UK-US preferential deal was a mirage. Now, the problem here is that if it is a fifth, and we're still not really sure what the actual tariffs are going to be. As I say, some people have been claiming the actual tariffs coming through are less than 10%. We don't know what's going on there. But we in the UK made concessions. We lost our biggest bioethanol plant, and we still get hit when Washington rewrites the rules. So we had a 10% tariff, and now that's going up to 15% just because the Supreme Court called him out. Now, unfortunately, the UK suffers the most here. And this is one of our, I guess, Brexit dividends, right? Yay. We're actually getting screwed now. So it was looking good for the UK. We were outside the EU. We had a preferential deal with the US. And we did that bilateral deal. So we're like, yeah, we got a better one than the EU. And then that all fell apart, and he slapped a 15% tariff on everyone, including us. And now we are at the bottom of the pile. So Donald Trump's new 15% global tariff, says the Financial Times, will most greatly benefit countries he has signed out for heavy criticism. So if you're doing, if he's already hammering you, China, Brazil, long-standing US allies, including the UK and EU and Japan, will suffer the largest hit from the new levy. So basically, if like Brazil, they're laughing. They're like, brilliant. It's down to 15% now. Happy days. Whereas the UK is now up, and we're screwed. So we come off the worst out of all of this. So that sucks. But Trump is just doubling down. He said on True Social, any country that wants to play games with the ridiculous Supreme Court decision, especially those that have ripped off the USA for years. Of course, he doesn't understand how trade deficits and surpluses work. He doesn't understand services, trades, deficits and surpluses in the services sectors. Anyway, we've been ripped off for years and even decades. Will be met with much higher tariff and worse. So much higher tariffs and worse than tariffs. So I don't, what are you going to attack us? Than that which they just recently agreed to. Buyer beware. Thank you for your attention to this matter. He's just like a big bully, just throwing his toys out the pram and flailing. He said again here, as president, I do not have to go back to Congress to get approval of tariffs. Yeah, but you do. It has already been gotten in many forms a long time ago. What? They were also just reaffirmed by the ridiculous and poorly crafted Supreme Court decision. What? So, as Derek Tainus here says, he's just crowned himself king for all infants and intents and purposes. For all intents and purposes. This man is just treating his own rule like a quasi dictatorship. He is his own king. Fascinating that he has pulled the US out of the World Health Organization. And this is peak Trump, by the way. So Representative Mike Levin points out that Trump's pulled out the World Health Organization, or pulled the US out, and now he wants to spend $2 billion per year from US taxpayer dollars to replicate the global disease surveillance system we already had at nearly triple the cost. We had a system that worked with the World Health Organization. Trump walked away from it, and now he wants to waste billions rebuilding it from scratch. That's not cutting waste, that's creating it. So Washington Post reporting exclusive, after pulling out of the WHO, the Trump administration is proposing spending $2 billion a year to replicate the global disease surveillance and outbreak functions the United States once helped to build, which will cost about 3 times as much. So to my American friends out there, these are your tax dollars. These are your tax dollars. He is spending, he is wasting. Just thought I'd let you know, in case you didn't realize. Going to the UK now. Nigel Farage. Let's talk a bit about Farage, and let's get Russia back into the discussion. As this all says, if only more mainstream news outlets were interested. Can you imagine GB News covering this? Well, no, because Nigel Farage is indeed a shareholder in GB News. Byline Times, a great media outlet. I support the Byline Times. I am subscribed to them. Nigel Farage, paid by a Trump crypto advisor who worked with Russia operative Paul Manafort. A former UK leader received payment from David Bailey, who collaborated with the convicted fraudster behind the Trump-Russia influence scandal. So although this could be a case of the fallacy of poisoning the well, it might be guilt by association, even not poisoning the well, guilt by association. actually, it's probably a little more than that. So Nigel Farage, they say, has been paid by a cryptocurrency advisor to US President Donald Trump, who worked with Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign chair, jailed for financial crimes after investigations into his Kremlin-aligned influence operations to lobby the president on Bitcoin policy. David Bailey, chief of BTC Inc. and a senior cryptocurrency advisor to Trump, brought Manafort into his lobbying operation in early 2024. Together, Manafort and Bailey spent the rest of the year working to persuade Trump to embrace Bitcoin and establish America's first strategic Bitcoin reserve. So do you remember when Trump on the campaign trail went to a Bitcoin conference and he admitted he didn't know anything about Bitcoin, but he was a Bitcoin president? Basically, when he says stuff like that, he doesn't know much about anything, Trump, but he is just a puppet being puppeteered, being manipulated by the puppeteers that are his lobbyists, the people paying money or just influencing, saying you need to go here and you need to say this. So I don't understand Bitcoin, but I'm going to be the Bitcoin guy. And then, can you sign this executive order, please? Can you sign this executive order? And he signs these things, but he doesn't know what he's signing. So we've seen him sign them and then turn to the person he's being asked to sign these by and says, so what's this one about? And then they explain it and go, oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. He's never heard these things before. He doesn't know what they are. He is not a president driving policy. He is a president having policy delivered to him in the form of executive orders that he just puts his pen to. And here's another example, making Bitcoin legislation or removing regulation to benefit these sorts of people. Bailey subsequently paid Farage as well a speaking fee through BTC Inc. months before the Reform UK leader unveiled his pro-crypto policy platform that mirrors the Trump administration's digital asset agenda. Paul Manafort's role in the development of Trump's entire cryptocurrency strategy raises questions about Bitcoin's role as a vehicle for Russian influence, in particular as a mechanism to weaken national fiat currencies. So this is a way of getting around sanctions. Famously, a cryptocurrency is being used by Russia to get around sanctions loopholes, and also involved heavily in Russian influence operations. Ilan Ihor from Romania, Moldova, involved in such schemes. And anyway, it goes on. There's a lot more to this. I'm not going to go into this in any more detail. I advise you go and find the Byline Times article here. But what I am going to do is use this as a segue onto how. So what was interesting from this little part here is that Farage is unveiled a pro-crypto policy platform that mirrors the Trump administration's digital asset agenda. What's important here for me as a Brit is to understand that Farage is just Trump 2.0. He is looking at everything that Trump is doing and says, I want to copy it. Here's the first example. Reform is to copy ICE. You know, the most controversial thing that the US is doing at the moment. Let's copy that, says Zia Yusuf. Because, of course, there's nothing more British than Gestapo-style police thugs terrorizing local communities and throwing 5-year-olds and grannies into detainment camps. It's actually what a lot of our British parents fought against. So reform would create ICE-style agency and end leave to remain. So the idea that you've got indefinite leave to remain, this idea that you can stay in the country and you've been here for so long, all this kind of stuff, just people that have been living for 25 years in the UK, suddenly we're going to get ICE to throw you out. That's what Reform are saying. Nigel Farage's party plans to deport up to 288,000 people a year on 5 flights a day and expand stop and search. So say what you like about immigration and whether you're for or against it, but that kind of approach, I think, would be highly, highly controversial. But it's not just that. Zia Yusuf will announce plans to restore Britain's Christian heritage tomorrow. This is basically just MAGA American, Christian nationalist politics. Introduce a patriotic curriculum based on Christianity to give children more things to take pride in again. Stop churches being converted into mosques by granting them listed status and requiring planning permission. Force police to search homes of everyone referred to to crack down on Islamic extremism. So Prevent is this anti-extremism agency where you report people to them, and it's not just Islamic fundamentalism, it's right-wing extremism, it's all sorts of different ones, but obviously there will be a large element of Islamic extremism. But force police to search homes of everyone referred to prevent in a crackdown on Islamic extremism. So just like loads of houses being searched. Launch outreach programs encouraging expats in Dubai and Singapore to return by pledging lower taxes. So all these billionaires that run off to Dubai, you can come back here, lower taxes, and it's just like, oh my goodness, big beautiful bill. Oh my goodness, all of this is looking like just copying Trump. And actually, I've seen another thing. I wonder if I can find it. Don't know if I've got time. There was a really interesting thing, because I've just seen the Reform UK big conferences are basically just copying MAGA. Reform signatures Trump. See if that will search it. Please no. I'm gonna have to look for it another time. But basically, you've now got Nigel Farage and Zia Yusuf standing up with these, just like you see Trump here, right? You know, the executive orders and these signatures, and you've started to get a Yusuf and Farage stand up with pieces of paper with their signatures on, saying this is what we're going to do, and they're basically copying, you know, the entire playbook of MAGA and the Trump administration, whether it be in policy or in the way they do things. So we had a Financial Times reporter ask him a question at a conference recently, and he treated her just like Trump treats female reporters, and was quite misogynistic and just shot her down. And the way he speaks to them, and he's just looking at what Trump does and says, that works. That works for me. It works for Trump. It works for me. But he's basically importing. If you don't think Reform UK are an American import, an American export, right, then you need to look again. And that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it. I'm going to get to your comments. I did have this is in the wrong place now. Marika Mikiashvili from Georgia again saying you can be jailed in Georgia if you accept American and European funding for any kind of organization, media or whatever, but you can accept Chinese funding. So that tells you the direction of travel there in Georgia. But that was not supposed to be at the end of the video. That's supposed to be somewhere in the middle. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in as part of my smorgasbord of stuff to talk about. Look, I've got so much more. I've got a whole section, actually more on reform. I've got a load on Donald Trump, lots to do with the elections that have been taking place throughout the United States at the moment. But I'll save that possibly for tomorrow. In the meantime, let's go through what some of you have said. I wasn't aware of this, Julian Rossiter. Thanks for your super chat. Slovenian elections are on March the 22nd. Another test to see if Europe can resist against the resurgence of far-right populism. An important few weeks coming for the EU. I wasn't aware of the Slovenian election, and I don't know anything about it either. But that's really good that you've highlighted that, and I will now be aware of this and keep an eye on whether you're going to see a kind of replication of what's going on in every other country, which is a surge in the far right, Euroscepticism being supported by disinformation campaigns from places like Russia, but also the US getting involved now in European political matters. I once swam in Lake Bled, beautiful. In Slovenia, when I took my camper van around, when I had a camper van, took it around Europe. Awesome source. One of my best mates has a backpackers in the Tariffs mountains in Slovakia. I've told you this before, but I remember before I had the boys, actually, so more than 15 years ago now, drove around Europe for 3.5 weeks with my missus, and stopped. It's just amazing. Europe's so brilliant, right? Because you can go into all these different countries just within. I remember one day we went, what was it? Austria, Italy, I think it might have been Austria, Italy, Austria, or something like that. Anyway, in and out, and then Dolomite Mountains, and then Croatia, something like that. I can't remember the geography exactly, but you're like, hey, today we've just gone into 3 countries, had breakfast in Austria, lunch in Italy, and we've had dinner in Croatia. It's just brilliant, and all the different sort of cultures and beautiful sights. Yeah, I would love to. I'd love to camper van around Europe again. Just absolutely brilliant experience that was. Did it a couple of years in a row. Anyway, that's enough of that. Johnny Nebregard. Hello, team. Hello, Johnny. Thank you for your Norwegian love, my friend. Mitch Ashdown. CETA is up and going. Trades currently being done not using US dollars. Over 40 countries and can use JP's microphone. Not quite sure what you mean by that at the end. So let's have a look here. Comprehensive economic and trade agreement. So I'd need to look into CETA. It seems to, is it with India? What does it mean for Canada? CETA. Let's have a look. Sorry about this. I'll have to look into this, Mitch. But obviously something to do with Canada, but it seems to be a lot to do with India as well and the UK. Here we go. Let's have a look. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, is a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union and its member states. It has been provisionally applied, thus removing 98% of the pre-existing tariffs between the two parts. So not about UK and India. I don't know why it's getting loads of stuff about that. But anyway, so that the free trade agreement between Canada, that makes sense for you to bring this up. And not using US dollars. That is very interesting indeed, isn't it? Because although on the one hand, some people are arguing that Trump wants to de-dollarize, and this is like the whole crypto thing, getting into crypto as a way of getting around the dollar, and then that has all its advantages, but also has disadvantages, and it makes it very difficult to sanction nations, so you have less political leverage. The US dollar gives the US the ability to sanction, but if you're trading more in Canadian dollars or more probably in euro, then that's going to be good for the euro. It's going to be bad for the US dollar. It will be destabilizing for the US economy to some degree, or for the dollar, and that has knock-on effects. So yeah, interesting. Over 40 countries can get involved in that. So anyway, I'll look into that in more detail going forward. But yes, thank you for that, and thanks for your support, Mitch, as well. I think it's fascinating to see the state of play at the moment, and this is kind of what I was talking about, how Europe's getting all pally with Zelenskyy, and there's a sense of unity within Europe as well, not with Hungary and Slovakia notwithstanding. And you've got Canada really playing a major role. Carney, if you look at the stats for Carney at the moment, Mark Carney's approval ratings are going through, is it Jean Chrétien, the previously very popular Canadian Prime Minister? He's at those levels. He is almost neck and neck in Alberta. So Alberta is a successionist state that is always pro-conservative, and he's got broadly almost leveled out the approval rating or the polling numbers for the Liberal Party with the Conservative Party in Alberta. Now that is insane. His approval ratings in Ontario are obviously very, very positive indeed, but then also in Quebec. So the Quebecois they're also would like their kind of French independence. They're also seeing Mark Carney as broadly popular, and Mark Carney has just been the absolute beast for Canada. I watched a video of him because there's this whole controversy to do with the ice hockey stuff, and he used to play ice hockey. I think that's half of how he got into Harvard or something like that. So he can get on the ice and he can hit a puck or whatever. So the idea that Trump's all about the Team USA, but actually Carney's the one that can get on the ice with these ice hockey players, and there's a great video there. But also did he not have the women's American ice hockey team and the Canadian ice hockey team? So the women's ice hockey team refused to go to the State of the Union address and I think the White House, and instead they've gone to Canada and had a photo op with Mark Carney with the Canadian women's ice hockey team. Absolute craziness going on there. So Mark Carney is, I think, at the moment the kind of He's the man of the moment in Canada, but actually outside of Canada. So people are looking to Mark Carney around the world as being a statesman who is exhibiting quite a bit of reliability and predictability, right? Which is what you want. I was thinking earlier today that the comparison between voting in a boring I don't think Mark Carney is particularly boring, but the idea that you got this boring technocrat like the former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. Oh God, why don't we just get some person who used to be on The Apprentice in, he's gone bankrupt, he's bankrupted 4 to 6 of his organizations, has been involved in all sorts of lawsuits, that's been found guilty of sexual assault, that's been X, Y, and Z. Let's vote that guy in. Or should we vote the guy in that was formerly the governor of a couple of international banks, a couple of national banks? Oh, let's go for The Apprentice guy. Oh, it's shits and giggles, isn't it? No, let's get the expert in, because it turns out that kind of expertise is useful on the international stage, that he actually understands meetings he goes to about fiscal policy. He understands macroeconomic pressures. He understands what is required in doing international trade deals for the benefit of both nations. He's not just some kind of playground bully that goes around the world trying to exact as much pain on others for his own benefit. So my opinion of Donald Trump is obviously pretty clear, but I think the contrast between, and interestingly, then you got Scheinbaum. Now Mexico's got its issues, hasn't it, with cartel things going on, but it's outside of that, the policies of Scheinbaum have been very popular and very successful, and she's an incredibly popular leader. So she sits on the left, Carney sits on the center left, I guess, up in Canada, and these two are really popular leaders that otherwise, cartel thing aside, are moving their countries in the right direction, it seems. And these are also people with expertise. These are serious people. Scheinbaum is a clever woman. She knows her onions, right? Carney is a clever man. He knows his onions. So I think this is why I get really peed off in the UK that everyone just piles in on Keir Starmer. Like, let's just have a dull, competent guy. Just keep things ticking over. Thank you very much. Let's not go nuts, because you'll get Farage in instead, and then we're just copying the United States, and we'll have some batshit crazy numbnut taking us into being MAGA 2.0. So, there's a time and a place for just quietly sensible leaders. Just get on and do your thing. Here endeth the lesson. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the mods. Thank you to the people who have super chatted. I really appreciate the support as well from last night in the live stream on Jonathan Finks. I thank you to all of you who helped out there. Niels Knudsen, and so many others, Mark Bisque, all the people who generously donated memberships. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Michael Winkler as well. Big love to him. And Mark Bisque too. Okay, I appreciate all of you. Take care, everybody. Hopefully that's a nice synopsis of what's going on, but I also meant to talk about Cuba. Forgot to do that. There's a crisis there, just in case you didn't know. Energy crisis, food scarcity, medical aid crisis of America's doing to a degree, like the sanctions, embargoes, oil not getting from Venezuela to Cuba, not getting from Mexico to Cuba. They're pressure on the Mexicans. Now, there's all sorts of moral evaluations we can do about that whole situation, but watch out for Cuba, because it's in a lot of trouble, and it would normally probably lean on Russia to help, but that then puts Russia in an interesting position, because they don't want to pee off the Americans or the Trump Americans, and so to help Cuba they would fall foul of the Trump administration. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but don't have the time, because I said I'm going to go, and this isn't going to be a half an hour long goodbye. So, as I've said to you before previously, and it bears repeating again, but I've said this to you before, but one more thing I will say